And welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Still Curtain Podcast. I'm your host, Tommy Jaggi, editor of StillCurtain.com. And joining me, as always, is Still Curtain contributor Shayne Kubas. Mike Tomlin, Shayne, has signed a 3-year extension that will keep him with the Pittsburgh Steelers through 2027. We are going to have that as our main talking point today. We're going to break this down in detail. What does this mean for the team? Was it the right decision? I'm going to share some interesting statistics that you may not know about Mike Tomlin when it comes to the playoffs. And so we'll discuss whether or not this was the right move. We're also going to talk about the wide receiver position. Calvin Austin is drawing some buzz, and there's been some rumors swirling once again, Shayne, that we need to talk about as it relates to the Steelers wide receivers. Before we do that, let's jump into the news for this week. Obviously, Steelers are at their mandatory minicamp. It's just a 3-day thing. It's really hard to take too much away from this, but let's talk about a few things from this, Shayne. And one of those is Russell Wilson feels the fountain of youth. He says, are you buying this? Like, obviously he's going to play off that he's feeling great. He's in the best shape of his career, all that kind of stuff. He basically, I mean, that's basically what he described. And he's feeling good. He's feeling confident. And this is a good fit. Do you think that he is feeling youthful as his age would suggest?
I think what he's trying to say, kind of, or why I think he probably phrased it the way he did, is because of the fact that his experience in Denver was not exactly very fruitful for him, and not just from on the field standpoint, but obviously Nathaniel Hackett's the coach at first, and that doesn't go very well, and that offense is a mess. Sean Payton comes in, and while Payton has a reputation for being an offensive guy, his offense is very much not what Russell Wilson has done before, and it isn't really what works for him. I'm not saying that Arthur Smith's offense is necessarily that much more built for a guy like Wilson, but I think he feels much more welcomed here. I think he feels wanted. And for a guy like Russell Wilson, that clearly, like, regardless of how, a lot of people say that he's a little bit fake or corny or whatever, he clearly likes, when people like him. Like, that's an important thing to him. And I think he feels that from the fans mostly, and the coaches and the players. I think everybody's gotten along with him pretty well so far. I do think he probably feels better than he has going into a season from a mental standpoint for a long time, probably.
Yeah, and you mentioned the fit. It is interesting. I think it's been interesting this entire time. Now, again, it's hard to pass up a veteran minimum contract for a player with a resume like Russell Wilson. Yeah. But if we look at some of the things that he has done or lack thereof, he's taken 100 sacks over the last 30 games in these past 2 seasons with Denver. He historically just has not thrown the ball over the middle of the field, something the Steelers want to do more often. And so the fit is questionable at best, I think, but there's reason for optimism for sure. I think that he feels he's with a better organization, more talent around him, a lot of factors going his ways with Mike Tomlin now, who we're going to talk about here in just a little bit. So we'll see. I want to stay on this topic of the quarterback position, Shayne, because just another thing that I didn't want to hear, we heard yesterday from Arthur Smith. And this is what he had to say. Russell Wilson is in pole position in the competition, obviously being the quarterback position. And we'll get to Latrobe and we'll see how, and I'm sure things will heat up then but both of these guys knew that when they were getting in here and were acquired, and we've been very transparent about this. So Shayne, my takeaway from this is that there is no quarterback competition. I don't know if you feel the same way or not, at least at the beginning of the season. And this is what Tomlin said. And again, this goes back to Ian Rappaport's report. When the Steelers signed Justin Fields, Rappaport reported that Mike Tomlin reached out to Russell Wilson and told him that he was the starting quarterback. It sounds like Arthur Smith is reiterating the exact same thing, even using the same phrasing, talking about the pole position here. Yeah. Are you getting the same sense of this, that there is no quarterback competition for the Steelers?
I think that what this ultimately means is that what we've assumed to be the case, which is that Russell Wilson was brought in to become the starting quarterback, is going to remain true until they are given a reason to stray from that. So what I think this ultimately probably means, why they are using the word pole position, because they don't want to have Fields go into this competition or go into camp with the idea that there's nothing he can do to win this job. Like, there's nothing. It does not matter how well he practices. It does not matter how well he plays in the preseason. None of that is going to mean anything in terms of whether he starts the season as a starter, right? I think they don't want that to be the case. And I think they don't want to have either of these guys feel that way. Because at the end of the day, Russell Wilson, yes, he has way more experience. He's played better football in his career than Fields has ever done. He has not earned anything with his play over the past 2 years. Like this version of Russell Wilson does not have any reason to believe that he should be a guaranteed day one starter for a team. Like that's just not what he's earned over the past couple of years. So I think giving him the idea that like, hey, if you do what you're supposed to do, if things play out the way we expect, you're going to be the starting quarterback. That's good for his kind of mental side of things and what he's looking to do. But Fields also has to know that like something can happen that would allow him to become the starting quarterback. I think that needs to be expressed to him. And doing it this way implies there's a competition, but also implies like we have a plan for how we want this to go, but we're open to other possibilities playing out.
Yeah, and Shayne, I don't know if anybody besides Mike Tomlin in the front office will know exactly what was said behind those closed doors to Russell Wilson, to Justin Fields at the time each of these quarterbacks were signed. But we are certainly have been given the impression, and that hasn't changed from now until then, that this is Russell Wilson's job. And that's just the way that it feels.
It's
and
his job to lose, at least.
His job to lose, for sure.
Right.
And I would go as far to say I would be shocked if Fields started the season as the starting quarterback.
Right. The week one starter is very unlikely, I think. Yeah.
It sounds like it was, whether written or spoken, just a kind of promised to Russell Wilson. And again, it makes sense. Why else would he sign for the veteran minimum? I know he's got money coming his way from Denver, but you can make more as a backup quarterback on a different team. If it was really about the money and not about the promise of a starting role, he could have made more somewhere else. And so it does feel that same way that it felt months ago, where this pole position language is really just saying, yeah, this is your job to start the season, and we'll go kind of take it from there.
Right. Yeah.
All right, let's move on to something maybe a little bit more encouraging than that. Is Zach Azzani, the Steelers wide receiver coach, recently praised one of his wide receivers. And it's not the one that everybody points to, George Pickens. He did talk about George Pickens briefly, noted his talent, but then his mood kind of changed, and he got really excited talking about Calvin Austin. This was posted to the Pittsburgh Steelers official YouTube account. You can go check it out if you want to. This is what Azzani had to say. He's been outstanding. That's a guy that's gone from here to here, and he used his hands to show like the difference between in the last 8 weeks. It's been really fun to watch. He's a worker. He's intentful. He's urgent. He wants to be coach. You can see it, and his game has improved. And so this is a guy that he's getting excited about. And Shayne, I think you look at him, another thing that he said about him was he is really, really excited if he continues at this trajectory. And so it's not hard to see why. And I think everybody's quick to write off Calvin Austin. This is a guy I really liked actually coming out of Memphis. And you look at his situation the first 2 years in Pittsburgh. First year, his entire season was lost. He suffered a foot injury early in camp, was placed on IR. And once that happens, you were done for the season, just like Corey Trice was last year. So didn't play at all his rookie season. Last year, he comes into a less than favorable situation with a Kenny Pickett that had taken a step back from his rookie season, believe it or not. And Matt Canada, who's just an incompetent offensive coordinator. It resulted in 17 catches for 180 yards and a pair of touchdowns, I think. And so it was nothing to write home about at all. Maybe he'll be given a bigger shake here in year 3. He's got talent. He runs a 4.32. He has an 11'6" broad jump. Like, this is the most explosive athlete on the team, even pound for pound, considering how small he is. Yeah. This is an elite athlete. Can they get him the ball in his hands? Do they have a plan to do that this year?
The thing I want to know with him is, are we going to see this team try to see if he can do what he did at Memphis, which was not the gadgety, like, he played on the outside at Memphis. And I understand his size is hard to look at and go, oh, that guy can play outside. If you're a Z and you can get off the line well enough and you can avoid press with your quickness like he did at Memphis, could he be the answer to the second outside receiver at times? Maybe not all the time, but at times. Maybe him and Wilson, because I think both of them are still probably better in the slot. Could they trade off those snaps? Could they both play on the outside a little bit and kind of give the team a chance to have their most explosive players out there, even if it's not always in the best position for them, and then one of them is always in the slot? That's what I kind of want to know, because I think Austin can run the route tree. Like, I think he can do all that stuff that an outside receiver could do, just without the size profile that you normally want to see out there, right? Mm-hmm. So That's what I want to know is like, what's his role going to actually be? Assuming he is playing this well and the coaches love him and everything like that, what do they want him to actually do for them? That's what I want to see happen, because they can praise him all he wants, but until I know like what they actually think he's going to be for this offense, that doesn't really matter much to me, at least on the field.
Yeah, I get it. I mean, we don't want to overhype him, obviously, before he's shown anything in the NFL. And I don't want to just use clump every small receiver together, but I can see some Tank Dell-like things out of him. And Dell was obviously tremendous with the Texans before his injury. I think that he can do something. He can offer this team something that they didn't have previously because of how fast he can get open, what he can do after the catch, all those things. So in slot Z receiver, maybe he can do some of that. I'll be interested to see where this goes. And I mean, my preference, Shayne, the Steelers don't make a move for a wide receiver. It's a trio of Pickens, Roman Wilson, and Calvin Austin, I think would be the most ideal. It gives you the biggest bang for your buck. The most potential, the most upside. We've seen, obviously, years of Van Jefferson, Quez Watkins, Scotty Miller at this point, and we know what those guys offer. I think the uncertainty of a Calvin Austin is intriguing more than anything else.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to move on to our big discussion topic for today. That is Mike Tomlin's contract situation. Just handed a 3-year contract extension from the Pittsburgh Steelers. And so Tomlin was scheduled to play through the 2024 season. Obviously, we don't often see contracts just flat out expire, especially from high profile head coaches like this. And so the contract extension itself was not surprising, but it is questionable. And I think that you can tote either side of the fence here, Shayne, and I can understand arguments on both sides. You can look at all the success Tomlin has had over the years. You can also look at the lack of success he's had in recent years. And so I want to ask you, I'll start with you, and then I'm going to share my thoughts here. Was this contract extension warranted? Should the Steelers have given him 3 years? Should they have offered him maybe kind of like the year-to-year deal, kind of like they did with Kevin Colbert right before his tenure ended? What do you make of this extension?
So I think what we should start with here with this, and I think as far as people who don't think he deserved an extension, right? I think what you have to ask yourself if you are on that side of things is, who do you blame more for the lack of high-end success? Because this guy has put us in a position to win every single season that he's been the coach of this team. There's the whole never had a losing season. I'm not putting a ton of stock into that, because we know what people say when you bring that up. Like, oh, who cares? Like, I get it. Do you put more blame on the end of Colbert's tenure as the GM, or do you put more blame on Tomlin's ability to coach the players that were given to him? That's what I think you first have to reconcile with as a fan looking at this. Like, because for me, I think they both deserve some amount of the blame for that situation. But if you look at the rosters that we've had since our last kind of like high profile teams, you look at the 2016 season where we get to the AFC Championship, like things like that, right? Those rosters were, while talented at times, were very flawed in multiple ways. And I know Tomlin has a big say in personnel stuff. We've always known that with him. But at the end of the day, Colbert was drafting these players. Like, he was the tenured GM. Like, his decision was ultimately what was being made. I think if you look at it in totality, what he's done since about, like I said, about the 2016 season where we haven't had the playoff wins, how many of those seasons and how many of the games that we were in at that time do you actually think that the Steelers were definitely the better football team in those games? Less than I think people think is the problem. And I think if you go back and look at it more, like especially like that Jaguars team that went off to almost beat the Patriots in the AFC title game, right? We should have never given up 45 points to that offense, but our defense could not do anything against them. And obviously Tomlin's defensive guy, so you can put that blame on him a little bit. You look at the Browns playoff game, right? The offense completely blows it up in the first 20, 30 minutes of the game. There's turnovers. Ben throws 4 picks. Like, all these games have stories behind them that are separate from the coaching job Tomlin did up to that point, right? There's a lot of reasons to sit here and say, like, oh, well, he didn't deserve a 3-year extension, especially. And I do kind of agree with that. The problem is, I think people are focusing on the results at the end of the season whenever you're not looking at how did they get there in the first place. Like, why did they even have a chance to get to the point to maybe win a playoff game? A lot of those rosters were just very weird. and not well put together at times. And it still worked. And he's still doing the same thing with a lot of these rosters. Guess what? They're not very like well put together at times. Look at our offense the past few years. Like this guy just continues to find ways to win games. And I think it's, again, at this point, it's hurting him because they're not getting the premium high end talent to help fix the roster. Right. So it's like his biggest strength is also his biggest weakness at times. So I do think he deserves the extension from the sense of what his body of work in totality has done. But I would have probably liked to see him do a year-to-year thing, just that way there is more of a chance to kind of flip the script and change to a new tenure if we want to do that at any point.
Yeah, I think that would have been more reasonable for sure. And Shayne, I'm going to take the other side of the argument here. And I know you mentioned Tomlin's hand when it comes to the roster and building that team. I think it's bigger than what a lot of people give it credit for. I mean, he didn't hide his interest in Devin Bush during the 2019 pre-draft process. Same with Najee Harris in 2021, Kenny Pickett. I mean, it makes me wonder, like, and I can't say for sure because I don't know how much is Tomlin, how much is Colbert, but he's so tenured in at that point that I feel like Tomlin is the kind of head honcho of the team there. And so was it his hand in that roster building? But even if we disregard that, Shayne, and we look at something that we know he's responsible for, and that's hiring the coaching staff.
Right.
We suffered through 5 total years in a row of Randy Fichtner and then 3 years of Matt Canada at offensive coordinator, 2 years of Fichtner, 3 years of Matt Canada. That's really condemning stuff to me. Like you've got it. You can't have a 5-year stretch where your offense is averaging like 18 points a game. And I know they had 1 year where they were scoring points, I think 26 points a game with Fichtner. Over the last 3 years, they've averaged 18-ish points a game under Matt Canada, and it's just not getting the job done. And so when they hired Arthur Smith, another guy who intends to run the football first and use the passing game limitedly, and that's just something that he's done, I want to see at least a year of how this is going to play out before I ink Tomlin to a deal through 2027. Like that's if this falls in line and this ends up being, we got to consider, I know that Arthur Smith was really good in 2019 and 2020 with the Titans as an OC, but as a head coach these last 3 years, he's hardly scoring more points than what Matt Canada's offense did. And he's calling the plays over there. And so if this trend continues, you cannot suffer through another 3 years of that. So that would be something that I find really incriminating against him right there is his own coaching staff hires. How many of these guys are going to be swooped up for high profile coaching jobs right away? If they lose their jobs, this is a responsibility of Tomlin. And so I do want to fault him for that a little bit because I think that obviously he has got the final say. He decides who's there, and it's kind of just been one unsuccessful hire after the next when it comes to the Tomlin coaching tree there. And so I think that's something he has going against him. I do think, before I get into this next part, Shayne, I want everybody to be very clear. I do think that Tomlin is a very good head coach. I still think that he's very good. However, there is a time when teams kind of just need to part ways and they need a fresh start. Things have gotten stale. I think that's the word that a lot of people use to describe the Steelers these past 3-4 years. Things have been stale. And so if we look at this next part here, Shayne, we talk about these statistics, it's easy to see why maybe just hitting the pass button would have been the best option and keeping the pressure on him, making him show it that you were right by hiring Arthur Smith, that you got what it takes, that you're going to bounce back, that you're going to get a playoff win or two. But let's look at these statistics here. 5 statistics that are just simply incriminating about Mike Tomlin in recent years when it comes to the playoffs. The first one, Shayne, is the Steelers are 3-8 in the playoffs since 2011. A lot of people will say, of course, why do you stop at 2011? You go back to 2010, they went to the Super Bowl. Then yes, but this is still a 13-year sample size. Yeah. And I think that's a long time to look at least. If I go back another year, sure, you can tack on a few more playoff wins that make that record look a little bit better. But let's talk about this past dozen plus years that Tomlin has been in the playoffs. The record is 3-8. There's been a lot of head coaches that have lost their jobs for a lot less than that. Now you can look at 11 total playoff appearances. That's fine. You're not faring well in these games at all. So let's look at the number 2 stat here in the playoffs. The Steelers, 3 postseason wins over the last 13 years have come against some questionable quarterbacks, Shayne. And you know where I'm going with this. Yeah. And again, I hate to point these things out, but it's just the reality of the situation. The Steelers in their 3 postseason wins over the last 13 years have been against A.J. McCarron, the Bengals backup quarterback, was forced to play that game. Matt Moore, the Dolphins backup quarterback, who you recall the Bud Dupree big smashing hit on him. In that
may
game.
have almost killed him in a real life game. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the third one was Alex Smith, a respectable starting level quarterback, but nothing out of the ordinary. And between it, they won the A.J. McCarron game by 2 points. They won the Alex Smith game by 2 points. The Dolphins game, they won pretty easily.
Yeah,
but again, you're the quarterbacks here, the 3 wins that you have. I mean, in these 11 games, those are the 3 quarterbacks that you beat in those games. It's a team sport, but that matters because you're going to face some really, really good quarterbacks in the AFC, and you have. And it's part of the reason why you are getting bounced. The third stat, Shane, that I have is the Steelers have lost 3 straight playoff games by double-digit points. Some of these have not been close, like the Chiefs game that started off close. Originally, TJ Watt scored that touchdown. They just blew the Steelers out of the water from there. They could not recover from that multi-score loss. They lost by 21 points in that game. In the Browns game before the year prior to that, the Steelers were getting smacked by the Browns. Everybody says, "Oh, Ben, look at Ben. He puts up he put up like 500 yards, but it's all in garbage time at the end of the game." No,
4
it's
interceptions too. So it's like
4 interceptions, and that contributed to why you got down early. They lose by 11, and then their most recent playoff loss, obviously, to the Buffalo Bills. You lose by a pair of scores. They're not just losing in the playoffs in recent years, Shane. They're losing by double-digit points, and they're getting so far down in these games. Now, the Bills one was the only one that really had a chance at going into the fourth quarter. The other 2 never stood a chance. You were playing catch up the whole time in the second half of the game. The number 4 stat here, Shane, the Steelers have allowed over 40 points per game in their last 4 playoff games on average.
Yeah.
So averaging 41.5 points per game surrendered in their final 4 playoff games. And this is dating back to 2016, 2017.
Yeah.
This is a big enough sample now that we're looking at this. Like, this is supposed to be Tomlin's strength. You get into the playoffs and your defense just isn't cutting it against these playoff teams. It might work for the regular season. It's not been proven effective in the playoff. Ironically, it was 2017 because that was the year TJ Watt was drafted, ironically enough, and you have one of the best defensive players of this generation. It's still not working. Tomlin's defense has not been working in the playoffs. And the final stat that everybody knows about, the Steelers are on a 7-year drought without a playoff win. I believe, if I recall the stat, there was only 4 head coaches in NFL history that have kept their job after a 7-year drought without a playoff win. And Mike Tomlin is now one of those guys. This is a lot of evidence. And Shane, if you look at the postseason and forget about the regular season, which is hard to do because Tomlin's 173-102 record and the regular season is really good, but just the postseason stuff over the last dozen years has been like cringeworthingly bad. It's not good at all. And so what do you make of this? Am I reading too much into this? Because I feel like what you need to do is build a Super Bowl roster, get yourself back on top. When I look at all this data, it's like, it's really scary and it's concerning that can Tomlin be this guy that gets them back in a situation to get to a Super Bowl again?
So I think what I want to say this, because I didn't say this in the conversation about whether he deserved an extension. There's 3 big weaknesses of Tomlin's tenure that I think are the reason why some of the stuff, whether it's the postseason stuff and also some of the perceived lack of like high-end finishes end of seasons that have kind of held him back. The first one you talked a lot about already was the coaching decisions, right? His ability to hire coaches and have them work out has been very questionable across the board for the most part, especially offensively. You know, we had the high-flying offenses in the mid-2010s, but a lot of that was stuff that, again, like once we got to the postseason, it dried up. Like it didn't quite work. And sometimes it was because one of the big, guys were out, whether it was Bell was injured or whatever it was, whatever the case may be, but still like they kind of dried up in the postseason and they weren't able to be as successful as they were in the regular season there. His inability to do that is one of the reasons why we're in the situation we're in right now. You also have the fact that, again, he didn't have, and this is not just on him because Colbert is the GM during this time, so it's also on him to do this. But like you said, depending on how you feel about that, who actually has more say on that is up for debate. We won't really ever know that now, especially. But they did not have a plan in place for Ben. They did not have a plan in place to replace him prior to him falling off the wagon, right? That's why you get the end of the 2020 season, you get the 2021 season. That never should have happened. I'm just going to be like, Ben should not have been on the football team, especially after 2020. You could argue after 2019 with the elbow injury. They didn't have a plan in place. They had opportunities to get guys that weren't drafted high in the first round that would have been a really good option for them. You look at a guy like Jalen Hurts. He got drafted in the second round. Mm-hmm. We could have taken him at any point in that draft and had him sit behind Ben for a year or two. Lamar Jackson, 2018. Now, obviously, I don't know if he would have been the same guy that he is for the Ravens as he is with us, with our offensive coaching, but at least, that's a guy that was super talented who you could have taken a chance on at the end of the first round. That is a big weakness of this team, especially at this point, too. And then the last one, and this one is a little bit harder to kind of blame him for because the amount of talent you would have had to replace is just hard to do, but losing all of the veteran defensive players that made those late 2000s, early 2010s defenses so good, when those guys retired and got older and left, even though the defenses have still been really strong, there's a few years there where the offense kind of took over because the defense wasn't as strong, right? And the teams were never balanced. And that's really the biggest thing that's I struggle with the postseason stuff that you talked about, is a lot of these teams that have been in the postseason since that 2016 season, they've been horribly imbalanced. We're talking about a defense that was either completely useless against good offenses and an offense that was really good, or the last few years, a great defense, but an offense that can't do anything, even if given it on a silver platter. There's just been this imbalance on one side of the ball for too long. And at first it was offense versus defense. Now it's the opposite, where the defense is strong and the offense is bad. They need to find a balance here. And I will say 2024 might be the first time they have a chance to kind of get there. Obviously, the defense is still far ahead, but that's the thing that's been so frustrating, is they haven't been able to put together a cohesive roster since the end of the Super Bowl runs in the late 2000s, early 2010s.
Yeah, it no doubt plays a factor. When you don't have a quarterback, you're kind of just scrambling around to find a serviceable option. That's part of it as well. And it goes back to, though, how much say did Tomlin have in drafting Kenny Pickett?
Right.
How much say did you have in hitting the pass button on Lamar Jackson and Jalen Hurts in a trade up for Justin Fields and moving up a few spots? Whatever the case may be, there have been windows of opportunity to grab guys. You don't have to wait until Ben retires. You don't have to wait until we get the worst quarterback class of all time. There's times to pounce. And this is where I was banging the table for them to do that prior to that. You look at a team like the Packers, Shayne, and look at Jordan Love. Yes, you went from Favre to Rodgers. They overlapped. Rodgers got to sit and learn. Rodgers to Love. They overlapped. Love got to sit and learn. The Steelers are not in favor of this because they have to win right now. They're always trying to win.
Yeah.
You're not ever thinking about the future. And so I'm hoping that part of their philosophy changes with Omar Khan and Andy Weidel in the front office, as opposed to
it seems
Kevin
to have
Colbert.
At least a little
you
bit.
need to be more future minded. You can't always be about the here and now. That's why you plateau and you don't get any better. And so I think that's part of it. But again, we'll never know that exact split between responsibilities, Tomlin and Colbert. But I do feel like he definitely had a hand in that. Shayne, so let's talk about what would the alternatives have been? If not Tomlin, or if not this extension, what do? You let him ride out the last year of his deal, and then where do you go from there?
I think that's part of the problem too, and I'm not one of the people that will sit here and be like, well, if they didn't sign him and they let him go, a team would snap him up in 5 seconds.
Yeah.
We all know that. Okay.
Yes, they would, for sure.
Everybody knows that. Now, a lot of people who don't care for him might say that the team would be making a bad decision, but it's still true. They know that's what
he would
happen.
be. Yes, he would get a head coaching job within minutes.
Absolutely. And people are like, oh, Bill Belichick did. And I'm like, Bill is older, a really bad situation that ended the Patriots. That's a whole other thing. Also, not many openings with how many good coaching hires we had this last cycle. So it just is what it is. But people may also say Vrabel, and it's still not the same track record as Tomlin. It's just he would get a job, right? We know that. The issue is I don't know at this point, especially you can look at a guy like Ben Johnson, right? He turned down jobs this cycle too, and one of them was where he would have gotten a chance to pick his own quarterback, right? That. It's tough to take to turn something like that. I understand Washington's a bit of a mess right now still, but they're trying to get out of that, and he might have been able to be the reason to get out of it if they did. A guy like that, sure, you'd love to bring in a guy like that, but would he pick the Steelers over other opportunities? I don't know, because we don't have, again, there's the idea, if you get hired for the Steelers and you're even okay, you're probably going to have a job for 15 years, which is nice. But it's still just, I don't know what their opportunities would have been. Like, would they have gone in the direction of an offensive coach? Because if they went in the direction of a defensive coach, why? Like, why bother if you already had Tomlin on the team? Like, because the thing, and this is what really kills them the most, and I mentioned it earlier, like, Tomlin's biggest strength is also his biggest weakness, in the sense that you can give him whatever roster you want, and he'll find a way to get 8 wins out of them. And as great as that is, like, as far as impressive as that is, it is a detriment whenever you shouldn't win 8 or 9 games. Like last year's team, they win 10 games. There is no reason that if you look at objectively how bad the offense was, there's no reason that team should win 10 games. I'm sorry. Like, and the worst part is they've lost 3 games they shouldn't have lost. Like that, and that tells you everything you need to know. Like, they still managed to get to 10 wins. Like, they go 5-1 in maybe the toughest division in football because of random reasons. Like, it doesn't even make sense half the time. This is what he does. He finds ways to get it done. And I think it honestly hurts him, like I said, more than it helps him at this point, because his teams haven't been good enough to make good on, oh, we made the playoffs with 9 wins. Great, let's go get curb stomped by the Chiefs or the Bills. Like, that's what you're getting rewarded with every year when you do stuff like this. So it is tough. And I understand why fans are frustrated with it, because it's hard to be upset with him for it, but it's also probably hurting the team in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think the simple answer here, Shayne, is there wasn't any great alternatives. That window didn't line up exactly the way I wanted to. Now, I'm a big Jim Harbaugh fan. I think that would have been a great opportunity. Yeah. Again, that would have required you getting rid of Tomlin while he still had a year left on his contract. I love Ben Johnson. I think that he's going to make an awesome head coach. He's going to have the field to pick from. I mean, he's right.
That's why you don't know if he would be interested. So,
although the Steelers, they have a tendency to give their head coaches a lot of time to figure things out. So the longest 3 tenured head coaches, I mean, 3 coaches since the NFL merger. So I think that Ben Johnson's job would have been pretty safe for a while had he chosen Pittsburgh. Yeah. But again, outside of a couple candidates, you can look and say, yeah, you're not guaranteed at all. Even with those guys, there's no guarantee that you're getting a Mike Tomlin. Like, Mike Tomlin's still going to be a Hall of Fame coach someday.
Yes.
So
the majority of coaching hires do not work. Let's just, like, I know the Steelers have bucked that trend for literally 50 years. 8 out of 10 coaching hires don't actually work out in the way that, like, if you want your coaching hire to win you a Super Bowl and have sustained success, that just doesn't happen very much. I just hate to, hate to break it to people. It just doesn't happen often.
Yeah. And that was my argument, is not that Tomlin's not a good coach. I think that he is really good. And I think that he deserves to be in the Hall of Fame with what he's done. He won a Super Bowl, went to another. He's got just an amazing regular season record. Obviously, he doesn't have the losing season. The recent years have not been as kind, but he still has that resume, and he would be snatched up really quickly if the Steelers let him go. Yeah, the question becomes alternatives. If the alternatives aren't there, what do you do? And you're not guaranteed to get that successor, that guy in place. However, Shayne, like I said before, I think that there comes a time when things get stale. We saw it with the Eagles, even with Andy Reid. Yeah. Andy Reid, he might be the best coach in the NFL right now.
He might be.
And the Eagles still won a Super Bowl after Andy Reid left there, and they went to another one again just 2 years ago
against him.
Against Reid. And so we actually have a chat about that right now. I'll pull that up. John chimes in. I don't think Andy Reid worries about the D because of Steve Spagnuolo. I'm not sure Arthur Smith provides that kind of balance for Tomlin. I don't think he does either. Right. Spags is so good that Reid doesn't have to worry about that at all. I mean, the focus can be 100%.
Spagnuolo's become in my opinion, a Hall of Fame coach without being a head coach. Like, that's the level of defensive coordinator he's been for a long time. That's something that's very hard to come by, obviously. And, like, you could argue, like, Reid with Spags combo might be the best coaching combo of all time. Yeah. But, like, at the same time, Reid is still the guy there, and that's what makes the team go. But having somebody that you can trust to go, hey, this is your thing. Tomlin has not been able to do that with his offensive coordinators in a very long time. Yeah. And Smith might be the answer there, but it's not a guarantee, certainly. And again, it's just been a kind of a streak that needs to end if he wants this extension to work out.
100%. I agree. And I think that you're looking kind of like absolute best case scenario here, because your head coach is defensive minded instead of offensive minded. Yes. I think you need to look at a situation like the Texans, like DeMeco Ryans and Bobby Slowick. Like, if you can be anything like that, then it will work out. But more often than not, Shayne, in today's NFL, I'd rather have the offensive minded head coach. I just think there's more evidence of that type of coach working out because everything's predicated on offense. You have to score points or else you're going to be bounced in the playoffs really quickly. And so I think that that would be my preference if the Steelers did move on a different direction. They're obviously not. And we've got 4 more years of Mike Tomlin. It's like the groundhog came out and saw a shadow and we get 4 more years of Mike Tomlin. So, so Shayne, what has to happen next? Like, we know Tomlin isn't going anywhere. Heck, he might get another extension when this one's done, depending on how things go. But what has to happen? Like, we talked about this 7-year drought without a playoff win. We just went over the 5 incriminating statistics in the playoffs. What needs to happen now with Mike Tomlin Steelers?
So let's start. I want to start with this conversation too, because I think the reason why this extension has a better chance of working out than I think even people who like Tomlin, even people who think he deserved this extension in general, I think why this has a good chance of working out is because of what Khan and Weidl have been able to do with the roster. They are building a roster in a way that Colbert did not. They are focusing on the trenches. They're focusing on, adding guys who have a lot of upside, who have a high potential, like a Peyton Wilson, Broderick Jones. Like, they're focusing on guys that aren't just going to fill a spot to get this team competitive. They're trying to find key cornerstone players who actually have a chance to be one of the better players at their position, just from a talent perspective, right? That's the biggest key to why this extension could work out, because now you're going to give, if everything works out, obviously, we have to see these guys continue to develop and play well and everything. But from a talent perspective, if you can figure out quarterback, whether it's Wilson and Fields or a rookie next year or whatever the long-term answer ends up being, if you can just get adequate quarterback play, there's really not going to be a reason why this team can't be legitimately competitive in the playoffs. Not just, we can get there, because you can always get there with Tomlin. He'll figure out a way to get you there. It's, can you come up with a offensive structure and a defensive structure that is competitive against some of the other teams that just frankly have better quarterback play, right? That's what Khan and Weiler are trying to do, and I think they've succeeded with that so far. This year is a key building block because you have a new offensive coordinator that has done this at a high level before, even though, again, his recent track record, it is what it is as a head coach. If he can just focus on the offense and not get too cute with it, like he did with the Falcons at times, if he can get better quarterback play out of, Wilson and Fields compared to the husk of Matt Ryan and whatever Desmond Ridder was doing the past 2 years, like, if you can just get adequate play from that position with a new offensive coordinator, they have a chance to actually turn these 10-11 win seasons into competitive teams and not just, well, we figured our way out here, let's go out there and see if we can get something done, right? Like, that's what has to happen next for them, is continuing to build the roster up to a point where there is no excuse, right? Because there's been excuses, unfortunately, for rosters like the Tomlin has had over the past few years. Lately, it's been Kenny Pickett or the husk of Ben Roethlisberger or whatever, or injuries. Now it's like you have to put a roster out there that there's no excuses for.
Yeah, and I think two things have to be resolved. Like, you need to know that Arthur Smith is the guy. If he's not the guy, you're in trouble because you just signed him to a 3-year contract. And you have to figure out the quarterback situation. Without those things, you're not going to compete.
Right.
And so I think that that has to happen. But we need to see playoff success like right now, like today. Like, if you are signing a 35-year-old quarterback, turns 36 during the season this year, to be your starting quarterback, you're trying to win now.
Yes.
I mean, regardless of what the front office is doing and how they're building the roster, it's clear that Tomlin is trying to win now, that you need to win a playoff game, and you can't have this drought continue. Shayne, I would ask you a question, and I don't know, we obviously don't have the answer to this, but what do you think it would take for the Steelers to cut this contract short for Mike Tomlin? Like, would you have to go like 6-win seasons back-to-back years? Like, what would it take for him to get the axe before this contract is up?
I think they would have to underperform back-to-back years for the first time under him. Because you could argue that just in terms of like the win-loss record, there's been very few seasons where they technically underperformed, where you're like, oh, that should have been like a 12-win team instead of a 9-win. Like, that just hasn't happened much with him. They'd have to seriously underperform for at least 2 years in a row for them to consider it. And partially because, and this is something else to consider, unfortunately, where, Rooney is not exactly he doesn't have the most money among the NFL owners. He's not as willing to kind of throw money at problems and try to fix them. So he probably doesn't want to pay Tomlin to not coach for him. He also probably doesn't want to pay the going rate for a top head coach candidate. And that's something else to consider here too. Like, I don't know how much Tomlin's extension is. I don't know if we've really known what his salary's been for any point. Honestly, I can't recall that being known by anybody, but I imagine it's probably not in the top 5, regardless of whether you think it should be or not. It probably isn't. I do think it would have to take, like you said, multiple like bad seasons by the Steelers standards, which they just haven't seen with him. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, they sell tickets. They're competitive every year. Tomlin has never played in a meaningless season finale game before.
Hilarious to think about.
So yeah, I mean, financially, it's working out for them that way. I mean, he's generating revenue because you're getting to these winning seasons every year, and every game matters. And so there's that factor going for him for sure. It's just I don't blame anybody that thinks that things have gotten stale and that they want to change. Like change. I feel like change is necessary at some point for everybody, regardless of how good it is. Like even like we knew that change was needed with Ben, for example, because that you could do worse than Ben as a starting quarterback, which we clearly saw after Steelers suffered through Mason Rudolph, Mitch Trubisky, Kenny Pickett. But you also need to kind of find that next guy. And you might have a few bad seasons when the Steelers look for their next head coach. You might have a few rough seasons, but eventually you need that guy that's going to lead you back on top. We'll see if whether or not Tomlin can be that guy that still does that or not. We've got another 4 years to find that out, I guess.
So.
Shayne, any chat you want to get to before we move on to our next
we have a bunch from John here that he's thrown out here. One of the ones that I thought stood out was, I'm not sure adequate quarterback play gets past Mahomes. You're right. Here's the thing about that. I do think if you are not the 49ers of the world, maybe the Eagles, because we've seen them get close, that might be kind of it in terms of teams that like should expect to be able to get past Mahomes. The Bills, I guess, but like they've struggled with it. If getting past Mahomes is your goal, there's nothing the Steelers can do about that right now. I'm sorry. Like there's just the quarterback play. If that's what you're worried about, they're not going to find you're not going to find a quarterback good enough to compete with Mahomes in their situation. Very likely Josh Allen can't get past Mahomes. So I don't know what to tell you. Like the second best quarterback in the league by most people's, opinion, can't get past Mahomes no matter how hard he tries. It's really not. If that's what your goal is, you're always probably going to be disappointed. That's part of the problem.
But Shayne, I think if the mindset is you need to keep taking stabs and throwing darts at the quarterback position, I totally understand that.
That is correct. Yes,
you've got to find somebody who not necessarily go toe to toe with Mahomes, but can win those shootout type games. Can make the game winning drives. And again, it's more than just that because Kenny Pickett did game winning drives, but he couldn't score for the first 3.5 quarters of the game.
Right.
So you need to find somebody who can put up points and can compete with the Joe Burrows and Josh Allens of the world. And so I don't think the Steelers should stop until they get that true franchise quarterback.
Yeah, and a bunch of other comments kind of about the Chiefs and how when one quarterback is taking pay cuts, following the Brady model, and other quarterbacks take big there's a lot of conversation about like the Chiefs are obviously the biggest talking point in the NFL in terms of like who you have to get through, right? And I'm not saying like the goal shouldn't be to get through them. It's that if your goal is when you're looking at quarterbacks, you're like, all right, which one of these guys can get me past Mahomes? That's a losing battle. That's not what you have to find somebody who's good enough to give you a chance. But if all you're worried about is like, I'm only interested in the guy that I think actually might be able to beat Mahomes in a game, then you might as well stop looking, right? Like you have to look at it different. Like you just want to see how good of a quarterback can I find? That's what it really should be, because you still need a good enough one to just get past the other guys in the AFC, because the AFC is a mess. Like it's just an absolute dogfight every single week, and it's going to be for a while. That's really not, again, that you just need to find somebody who can give you a chance, not just, oh, that guy can definitely beat Mahomes. That guy doesn't exist. I'm sorry. At least right now, it doesn't happen. It's just not a thing.
And we'll soon find out what they have in their quarterbacks, if anything at all. I have a feeling that quarterback could very well be something that's on the radar in next year's draft if they don't see the promise that they're looking for. And again, it's hard to be super optimistic about Russell Wilson, who turns 36 in November. I think what's the best case scenario there? Like he has a quality season. He's like the 15th best quarterback, and do you pay him a multi-year contract extension at that age? Like I think what fans should be rooting for to happen for the betterment of the team in the future is that Justin Fields gets that job at some point, runs away with it.
Yeah, that'd be ideal.
Shows all the traits that we've seen the flashes of in a more consistent fashion, and looks like a franchise quarterback. I think that's really optimistic. I don't know if he's going to do that in year 4, but I think that is the one hope that can kind of save the future of this team without looking ahead and saying we need to draft another quarterback, which could, I mean, very likely is going to end up being the case here at some point. All right, Shayne, let's move on to our next discussion topic here. If you are a fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers and you would like to support the Steel Curtain podcast, please consider subscribing to the Steel Curtain podcast on YouTube. We appreciate all of your support. All right, Shayne, let's talk about the wide receiver position here. We talked about Calvin Austin earlier in the show today and what he could potentially bring to the team. Mm-hmm. But these Steelers trade rumors are not going away, as you kind of expect. We saw at the NFL draft, it's like Steelers restructure Alex Highsmith's contract. They get all this extra money. Is a move going to be made? And now we're looking weeks past that. We're into the summer now, and the Steelers have not made a move for a receiver. But one NFL insider is saying that he would be stunned if this move didn't happen still. This is Jason La Canfora that said this on his podcast, that he would be stunned if the Steelers don't make a trade for a wide receiver by the deadline. And I think that some of the names, obviously, that are being floated out there, Brandon Aiyuk, Deebo Samuel, Cortland Sutton still. Will the Steelers do something like this? Should they do something like this? So the other talking point from this week, Shayne, just came out recently, was the 49ers reportedly offered $26 million per year to Brandon Aiyuk, and I'm sure he turned that down, knowing what the receivers are going for these days. I mean, Amon-Ra St. Brown is getting $30 million plus per year. He's going to bide his time. He's going to wait for that opportunity. He's coming off an incredibly efficient season where he averaged almost 11 yards per target. I think he had 1,400 yards. And so just crazy numbers here. And so he knows his worth. He's going to hold this out a little bit longer, see what he's going to get. Now, I think the situation is interesting, Shayne, when you look at it as a whole. We don't know if the Steelers are actively pursuing this or not, if they're still interested. We do know that the Steelers reached out to the 49ers during the NFL draft, actually while they were on the clock in the second round, to gauge the asking price for Deebo Samuel, the other 49ers wide receiver. And it wasn't in their wheelhouse there to execute a trade like that. The asking price was too high, knowing that they would have had to also turn around and give him some money as well. Can something get done here? And I think that what makes this so interesting, you look at a team like the 49ers specifically, this team is set to be $37 million in the hole next year with the projected cap, according to Over the Cap. And so look at their receiver group, Shayne. You've got a Brandon Aiyuk who is going to need a new contract very soon. You've got Deebo, who is making a lot of money already on the big deal that they handed him. They spent a first-round pick on names
Pearsall.
Escaping me right now. What's that?
Ricky Pearsall. Yeah.
Ricky Pearsall. And then they just paid their other wide receiver, Juwan Jennings. And so they've got a really interesting situation here. Can you afford another contract here? I don't think you can. Like, I don't know how much money you can move around to get this done. You can always tack on void years to guys. You can backload contracts. You can extend that window a little bit longer, but it makes sense as to why we keep hearing the 49ers pop up in these trade rumor circles, because I don't know if you can keep Deebo and Aiyuk around beyond the 2024 or maybe even the 2025 season.
That's kind of the biggest question with this team in terms of like why these rumors are floating so much. Like, why has there been so much movement on Samuel and Aiyuk? Because teams know, and I think the Niners know, that like realistically paying both of these guys beyond this year is just probably not very financially responsible when you have an offensive mind like Kyle Shanahan. I'm not saying that they can replace Aiyuk easily. Like, I'm not even saying Pearsall can be Aiyuk, or I'm not even saying he could be Deebo Samuel. But guess who found and drafted those guys to play those roles? Shanahan. That's who did it. Like, he is if anyone's going to be able to move on from their skill position talent, it's probably Kyle Shanahan, because he knows what he wants. He knows what to look for. And paying those guys both $20 million plus a year, and with Aiyuk, that number is going to have to start with a 3 in terms of yearly salary. Like, that's just the end all be all of it, especially with the extensions we've seen. I don't think it makes sense for him to do that, as great a player as he is and as good a player as he's been and will continue to probably be, especially because they don't know what they're going to do with Purdy probably, because he's been great for them. But you want to pay that guy by the time his deal will be coming up $50+ million a year? I know I wouldn't want to do that. Just my personal opinion, especially if I'm paying all the receivers around him too. Like, it's just too much. And I think that one of these guys is going to be gone. Now, I don't know which one it's going to be. Aiyuk makes the most sense because you can get the most for him. He's going to be the more expensive one. Samuel, even though he's older and probably a little bit more beat up at this point, still provides a lot for this offense in his specific role. It's harder to replace his skill set, I think, than Aiyuk's, even though Aiyuk is a better player. I think Pearsall's probably a better kind of guy to fit Aiyuk's role than he would be Samuel's. It's just a lot of moving parts with it. But they also have to be willing to eventually kind of probably take less than ideal value for him if teams aren't willing to budge on whatever they want. It's probably a first-round pick is what they're looking for, and I totally get that for a guy like him. But it hasn't come so far, I don't think. And if it has, they haven't been willing to pull the trigger on it.
Yeah, and for a team like the 49ers, when you're a Super Bowl competitor, basically every year, you make these moves to go out and trade for a Christian McCaffrey and turn around and pay him money. You get Javon Hargrave and Chase Young. And so guys are getting paid there. You just don't have the funds to go around unless you do a lot more restructuring, extensions, backloading, void years, that kind of stuff. And they've already done that to some extent. And so it does look like one of these receivers has to go. I don't know exactly when, but I can't see in 2025. I don't know if I see a situation where Debo and Aiyuk are both on this team. And I think that's why this keeps being brought back up time and time again, because the Steelers have reached out to that team. And the Steelers, obviously, at least on paper, it looks like they have a big need for a starting wide receiver to pair with George Pickens. We'll see what Roman Wilson and Calvin Austin, whoever else offer there. But that is the question. And so it comes down to, Shayne, should the Steelers trade for a wide receiver? Are you in favor of this? I know this is something we talked about weeks ago on the podcast, but let's revisit this for a second because this is all popping back up again. Knowing what we know now, you've got Roman Wilson on the roster. Things are looking encouraging, at least. And obviously, these guys are in shorts. The coaches aren't going to say much negative about them in minicamp or OTAs. But would you trade for a wide receiver? And I think the other factor here, Shayne, knowing how well this team is drafted over the past 2 years, are you willing to part with that draft capital?
So I do think they should trade for a receiver. I do not think it should be one of the Niners receivers, though. Okay. I think that's a little too much because of what you probably have to give up and because of what you're going to be paying them, especially Samuel, because as great as a threat as he is with the ball in his hands, and Arthur Smith does like to try to get the ball in the hands of his players in creative ways, I just don't know if he will return value in the same way that he should that he does for the Niners, for example.
Yeah.
But Courtland Sutton's the one that I keep looking at and going, okay, with the quarterbacks we have, with the offense that we have, having two elite ball winners on the outside. We're talking about two of the best at going up and getting the football against man coverage, right? There's very few players who do it better than Pickens and Sutton. That would be very hard to pass up when you have then two other guys in Austin and Wilson who are going to be great threats underneath with the ball in their hands. Like, that is a complete wide receiver group, in my opinion. That's something you could have if you wanted to give up whatever it takes to get Sutton. Now, at this point, I don't know how much they actually want to get rid of Courtland Sutton because Sean Payton is an enigma at this point to me. Like, I don't know what he actually wants to do or doesn't want to do half the time. But I think if he could be had for a third-round pick and maybe some change, a throw-in player or another pick later, I would pull the trigger because then there's no question about whether there's enough talent on the offense. There's already really not that many questions for me outside of the young offensive line gelling quickly. I think they're talented enough to be a top half of the league offense with the quarterback play if it's good enough. But this would remove all doubt about whether or not there's enough talent in the room. And I would definitely do it if given the opportunity for like a third, like I said, maybe some other stuff there.
Yeah, I mean, that would certainly make everybody feel more comfortable about the receiving core. Now, I think that obviously Courtland Sutton, he is who he is at this stage of his career. He's not going to offer a lot after the catch, but he is really good at the catch point. And so if Pickens were to go down with an injury, and even if he wasn't, I mean, they both stayed healthy all year. You can play those guys side by side. Yes. I think he would be a pretty good fit in that offense as well. It comes down to the capital. And I guess the other question besides that, Shayne, is, are you willing to part with the draft capital for a chance to better your roster to win right now? And I think that a lot of people would say yes to that in a heartbeat because this team has not won a playoff game in 7 years. I might be a little bit too forward thinking. I admit that, but you look at what the Steelers have done with their mid-round picks in these last couple of years. You get a Roman Wilson and a Peyton Wilson and Darnell Washington and even Nick Herbig in the 4th round. Like they're getting talented players on rookie deals because the contract stuff does matter too. And when you can just find, if some of these guys end up being starting level players and you're getting them for pennies on the dollar, like that's so beneficial to your roster. And so I hate parting with capital when I feel like a team is drafting really well. And I think that you could argue the Steelers might be the best drafting team over the past 2 seasons. I wouldn't go back any further than that, but over the past 2 seasons, they've had some really strong drafts on paper. We'll see how it plays out. Obviously,
you still have to let it play out. Yeah, but
that would be my hesitation there, Shayne. And I do like, I like the uncertainty of what they could potentially have there with the guys on hand. Now, Austin is bite-sized. I mean, the guy is under 5'8", 5'7 3/4", 170 pounds. I don't have a lot of hope that he's going to be a full-time receiver if he does carve out a role. And then Roman Wilson's not big either. He comes in under 5'11", it's compact frame. I think that Wilson could still be potentially that number 2 receiver for them. He's got soft, natural hands. But again, he wasn't particularly great after the catch at Michigan, and you expect a smaller guy to be better in that area of his game. And so if it's about winning right now, you want to kind of pull that trigger and get something done. I would agree. I think it probably makes more sense to do the lower risk type of move in a guy that doesn't need as much money, obviously, as selling the farm for that opportunity. And then maybe risking, if you do it for Debo, maybe he doesn't have that much left in the tank, or maybe he's a worse fit with the Steelers. Maybe Aiyuk takes a step back significantly in his efficiency, because I think those guys are already with the most efficient schemed up offensive mind in the NFL. And so would be my concern, taking them from the 49ers and putting on a team that's less creative, as well as what are they going to be on this team? So, because I think that there's a lot of guys who could be efficient players. They're not Aiyuk or Debo level, but could be really good. And so that is the question that it all comes down to. What are you guys' thoughts? We would like to hear what you have to say about this. Should the Steelers trade for a wide receiver? It's not too late. They could do it at some point in the summer. It's something that's still being talked about. So drop that down in the comment section here on our YouTube channel. We go live every Wednesday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern time here on YouTube. Thank you all for joining us on the show today. You can follow Shayne on Twitter at Shayne Kubas. You can follow me on Twitter at Tommy Jaggi. You can download the Still Curtain podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Check us out on YouTube, or ask Alexa to play the Still Curtain podcast. And thanks again for listening to the Still Curtain podcast.